By the end of this session, you will be able to identify current responsibilities and ways of working as a team, highlight potential next steps, and create a plan to share key information about the role of the PBIS team with your PBIS team. The Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or TFI line items that this session most strongly aligns with are 1.1 and 1.2, which focus on team composition and team operating procedures. So why a strong focus on teams? Implementation teams make it happen. They support the development, refinement, and sustainability of strong systems and supports. According to research around sustainability, school-based leadership teams influence sustainability greatly, often more directly than other factors. As this school year begins in various formats and potentially adjusts throughout the year, it is going to be really important that the implementation team prioritize the work and focus on strong support for staff so they have the skills and resources to do what they are being asked to do. The work of an implementation team serves a different purpose than the work of a committee. To be clear, in this session, we are not going to be talking about committees, which tend to be more short-term, project-based, and task-oriented in nature. While both types of teams are important, they serve different functions. Given that most teams in schools are comfortable doing the work of committees, this session is going to focus on implementation teams. As stated before, implementation teams support the development, refinement, and sustainability of strong systems and supports. They do this in 3 key ways. First, through strong shared leadership, which includes strategic communication, guidance, decisions, and resource allocation. Second, by developing, refining, and sustaining professional learning and support structures, for example, coaching for all staff. This would also include the selection and use of a fidelity measure or measures. Third, by analyzing, communicating, and responding to multiple types of data in ways that result in continuous improvement of support for educators to implement practices as intended. Keeping in mind that the implementation team supports the development, refinement, and sustainability of strong systems and supports in those 3 key ways: strong shared leadership, professional learning and support structures, and data, having the right people on the implementation team is critical. I'm going to give you a moment to read line item 1.1 from the TFI, which is what's up on the slide right now. Okay, so let's break this down. Strong shared leadership is one of the key ways the implementation team supports the work. A school administrator needs to be an active member of the team. They have the positional authority to make decisions around communication, resource allocation, time, and focus that allows the work of the team to move faster. The TFI also lists a systems coordinator. This is a role of someone on the team, not necessarily a position like school administrator. The coordinator needs to have knowledge and expertise in team function, systems change, and implementation. Because the implementation team supports the development, refinement, and sustainability of strong systems and supports, there needs to be a mix of individuals with varying knowledge, skills, and expertise. Rather than thinking through these 4 as individuals, consider them knowledge and skills that need to come together to create the conditions that will allow your team to move the work forward. So item A, applied behavioral expertise, is really about ensuring there is understanding and ability to select and define evidence-based practices in the area of behavior. Item B, coaching expertise, is about support for staff. Coaching expertise is critical in supporting the development, measurement, refinement, and ongoing use of a coaching service delivery plan for staff. Item C, knowledge of student academic and behavior patterns, is about understanding and using data. The team needs to have access to and actively use multiple types of data, including school climate and policy data, staff practice or fidelity data, training and support data, and academic and behavior student outcome data. Item D, knowledge about the operations of the school across grade levels and programs, is about an understanding of context. The team needs to have a strong understanding of the school climate, how the building operates, what programs and practices are implemented where, when, how, and why, and what professional learning and support staff access and how. Finally, students and families. A diverse stakeholder perspective is critical. Implementation teams need to not only include stakeholders as team members, but also actively elicit ownership, voice, and broad representation of their families and communities, especially underserved families and communities. As this slide shows, perspectives and voice of students and families, the team, and staff carry equal weight. Having the right people is just the start. In order for teams to be effective, all members must understand the role of the team, including goals, objectives, and scope of the work. The team also needs to have strong operating procedures, including communication plans, agendas, meeting roles, implementation, and action plans. And all of those should be clearly defined and written down. Additionally, team procedures need to include structures and practices that use data for decision-making and ensure diverse stakeholders have an authentic voice in the process and outcomes. So that was a lot of information in about 11 minutes. I am going to give you all a little time to reflect on what you heard, then consider your team and how it functions. In a moment, you will see a poll pop up on your screen. Please select all items that are true about your current PBIS team. Okay, so some of the big ones for people who responded, a lot of people responded that having a strong understanding of the school climate, how the building operates, what professional learning and support staff access and how they do that. That was a real big one. A lot of you felt was a strength. About half of you also felt data was a strength. And then some areas that were lower with responses included having a well-developed support or coaching service delivery plan, and also the piece around ensuring stakeholder voice. So, understanding that your team is an implementation team and not a committee, ensuring your team is made up of the right mix of knowledge, skills, and abilities, and that there are strong operating procedures is critical to strong implementation. As we think about strong implementation of PBIS, we should all agree that instruction is a key piece of PBIS. One of the most important roles of the PBIS team is to ensure the system is in place to support staff in using high quality instructional practices. Core components of instruction can include things such as provide clear instruction, so defining what students should learn and why it is important. Model, demonstrating skills consistently, repeatedly, and with examples. Provide multiple, meaningful, engaging opportunities for students to learn and practice. So using a variety of materials or strategies to generate new knowledge, extend critical thinking, promote reflection, and engage students. Provide prompt feedback. So giving verbal and nonverbal positive and corrective feedback towards effort and response to content. And adjust based on students' engagement with and response to instruction. So checking understanding and adjusting pacing, additional practice, or manner of instruction based on student need. Keeping instruction in mind, we will be looking at 3 key areas an implementation team is responsible for, including clearly defining core components, ensuring the provision of professional learning and ongoing support, and using multiple types of data for decision making. In this next section, we are going to look at some common pitfalls within these 3 key areas and how to overcome them. You will have a couple of minutes on each slide to reflect on current practice, share thoughts with, and learn from the group. While there are critical pieces of PBIS besides instruction, we will be using instruction throughout this section as the example. So let's start with core components. The biggest pitfalls in this category occur first around the identification of core components and then the definition of those components. So we just took instruction, one of those key pieces of PBIS, and we identified 5 core components: provide clear instruction, model, provide opportunities for practice, provide feedback, and adjust based on student response. Here is where the identification pitfall comes into play. Rarely do teams identify the core components. In this example, core components of instruction that staff are expected to use. And by identifying, I mean the team is saying that when we talk about instruction, these are the 5 things we are talking about. And here's the thing, if core components are not identified, if you as a team have not said, when we are talking about teaching, these are the 5 things we are talking about, the practice elements, what staff should actually be doing within each of those core components, cannot be identified and clearly defined. And that leads us to the second pitfall. And this comes into play for teams that have identified core components, in this example of instruction. And I'm going to be totally honest, we rarely see teams that get to this point. For the small number of teams that do get here, we actually see many stop here and simply inform staff of the core components as an expectation for them to do. Think about it. You need to provide feedback to your students. Feedback is really important for student learning. Provide high rates of feedback. Rather than taking those core components and further defining them by identifying and describing the practice elements that make them up in terms that can be taught, learned, consistently implemented, and assessed in practice. Not identifying core components first and fully defining them in terms of practice elements leads to inconsistent understanding and application by staff. Take a minute and reflect. How has your team fallen into this pitfall?
So I see some people are saying just inconsistent definitions of core components, inconsistencies across staff understanding. A couple of people have said something along the lines of that the leader of the team kind of understands the core components, but they're not being clearly communicated or disseminating to staff, which makes a lot of sense. That's something that we definitely see as well. Yeah, a couple other people saying the same thing, like from a teacher perspective, it was, I can understand now being on the team thought one thing, but what was communicated to staff was sort of disconnected. Yeah, not all staff are kind of working from the same perspective, same base understanding. And then the other thing is just sort of carving out the time to make this a priority as well. Thank you for those that are sharing in the chat. This is something that we love to do live, and it's so great to at least see some of your thoughts come through. So we really appreciate you taking the time to chat into this. And staff turnover, just kind of keeping everybody in the loop. Yeah, very similar themes coming up in terms of just either they've been defined but not well disseminated or communicated, or they just haven't been.
Okay, thank you, Emilie, for sharing those. So as we think about that, how to overcome some of those pitfalls around the core components. And one big step is to really focus on this, right? So now that you recognize this is something that you could think about further developing. And you could do that by clearly identifying and defining what you want staff to do. Again, clearly defining core components means that practice elements are identified and then further described in terms that can be taught, learned, implemented, and assessed in practice. This is about staff practice. Note in this example, and this is just an example, the core component provide opportunities for students to learn and practice is identified at the top of the table. That component is then further defined through practice elements. In this example, you can see in the left column one of the practice elements, and that is prompt students right here. The practice elements are then described with more detail in terms of staff practices. In this example, in 3 ways: expected use in practice, developing use in practice, and not acceptable use in practice. Note that the expected, developing, and not acceptable use in practice information is not developed to hand out to staff. It is not a rubric, and it is not used for evaluation. It's used by the implementation team to inform professional learning and staff support. So we've just set the stage. We have defined what it is that staff need to be able to do through the identification and definition of core components and practice elements to inform the professional learning and ongoing support for staff. The next set of pitfalls occurs within professional learning. Remember, from earlier in the presentation, one of the roles of the PBIS team is to develop, refine, and sustain professional learning and support structures for staff so that they are able to implement practices as intended in order to achieve student outcomes. The first professional learning pitfall is providing professional learning that is optional. There is not a commitment to ensure all staff have the same information, knowledge, and skills. 2 examples we see are professional learning being scheduled when all staff cannot attend, and the menu of options, where individuals self-select professional learning. So everyone attends something, just not the same something, and oftentimes not even related somethings. The next pitfall is providing professional learning that is vague, theoretical, and or disconnected from other professional learning or initiatives or work. Sometimes there is not a broad professional learning plan that identifies the knowledge and skills staff need to have with aligned, well-designed training plans, think lesson plans, for the knowledge and skills. If there are training or lesson plans, they are often one-offs and may or may not be well designed. The third pitfall is providing training in lieu of ongoing support. So training is provided, staff attend, and are then expected to take that information, go back, generalize, and implement it in their environment on their own. And the fourth occurs around data and can look like a couple of different things. One, data is not collected to measure training effectiveness, to understand what attendees knew before and know immediately following a training. So something like a pre-post assessment. And or practice data is not collected to understand how individuals are applying the information in practice. And two, even if those types of data are collected, they may not be used to inform future professional learning. An example of that could be strict adherence to a professional development calendar that was created for the year and is followed regardless of where staff are at or what they need. So take a minute to consider and share in the chat, does your team fall into any of these pitfalls? If so, which ones? What do they look like?
So I hear some of the pitfalls echoed in the chat. Vague resonated with folks, and the idea that they were self-selected or not aligned. Data might be collected but is rarely used. Wow, you guys are coming in hot. This is just awesome. This one must have really resonated with people. Professional learning is really squeezed into staff meetings. So like we have a full staff meeting agenda, and then if we've got 10 more minutes left, we're gonna just squeeze it in there. A lot of people saying data is collected but necessarily used to inform, was the training good, what supports are needed later. Yeah, we need more professional learning within our team so that the team can deepen its knowledge and then grow that within the staff. We provide the professional development, but the support and follow-up is not there. Yes, somebody just said, now, Macy said, now go off and use this, have fun, go for it. So I appreciate that, because I think that that is often commonly, you know, we give a lot of good information and then yet it's not, that's kind of the end of it, right? We move on. Like Liz said, there's that strict adherence to a professional learning calendar. Yeah. Yep. Vague, disconnected, new staff feel a little lost. Very much this common themes throughout this. Thank you for sharing in the chat. Yeah, thank you for putting those ideas in. That's huge. Knowing how to participate on a team isn't the same skill set as providing high quality professional development. Yes, we'll actually be talking about that as we go in a little bit more tomorrow too. Thank you, Julie.
Great, thank you. And I wrote some of those down as well so I could come back to them. I think here's one thing just around professional development. We often get really busy just trying to do lots of it or get it in or say, okay, we did that. And if staff aren't able to go back and don't feel supported and comfortable in doing it and aren't able to do it, it doesn't really make sense for us to keep doing more of that same thing, right? So here are a couple things. One, your team needs to be very intentional around team composition. I know it probably seems strange that I'm coming back to this when we should be talking about professional learning. But when I support teams, one of the things I often have them reflect on, even if it does not feel like this is a team issue, is the purpose of their team, who is on their team, how do they participate, and how do they see their roles. A lot of deeper issues are often addressed here. And some of you were talking about time. It's just squeezed in. It's not a priority. We just have to keep going. If you think back to some of those roles, even professional learning that's vague, right? If you think back to some of those roles of people on your team, you should have people on your team that are really skilled in professional learning and support. You should have an administrator that's really active on your team and can make some of these decisions and make space. And you do need to go back to that purpose, because if your purpose is strongly linked to your school improvement and district improvement goals, there might be some things that need to be considered so that the work is able to move forward. So you may consider as teams going back to some of those earlier slides as a starting point and just reflecting on some of the team pieces if you are experiencing some significant barriers, even with professional learning. Once your team is clear on purpose, has the right members, and by your team being clear, that would also include your administration, have the right members, and is highly functioning, you will be able to address the professional learning barriers to ensure the 3 key points on this slide are present. 1, professional learning is required and provided before staff are expected to use practices. 2 kind of subpoints to that. It is provided around clearly defined knowledge and skills, which is why it is so important to ensure core components are identified and then defined through practice elements. And it uses the same great instructional strategies we would use with students, right? Clear objectives and outcomes, opportunities for practice with feedback, alignment within an ongoing plan, adjustment based on staff response to that instruction. Next, all professional learning needs to be data-driven. So some of you had said, oh, data, yeah, we collect data, we don't use data. And that might be something to think about or a space to consider focusing on. Implementation teams need to collect pre and post training data and fidelity or practice data. So what does it look like in practice, not just in a controlled setting, right? And they do this to measure effectiveness of training on adult practice and to inform future training and support opportunities. So it's really that data is used for your team. It doesn't reflect on staff at all. Finally, professional learning needs to be provided with that intentional ongoing support. And it might be worth looking at some different structures to think about, are there things that you currently have that you could leverage to provide that ongoing support? Because here's what research says about professional learning and coaching or support on implementation. When we look at the impact of professional learning that primarily uses presentation of theory, so right here, this row across, for instance, lecture, you can see that participants' abilities to understand are relatively high. They can explain main concepts. When we look at skill attainment, participants being able to demonstrate the skill and use with fidelity, those percentages are relatively low. In the second row, when modeling is added to professional learning, participants' understanding remains relatively high. Their ability to demonstrate the skill goes up marginally, but their ability to use the skill with fidelity remains low. In the third row, when practice, including feedback, is added, participants' understanding remains relatively high. Their ability to demonstrate the skill goes up significantly, but their ability to use the skill with fidelity remains low. Once coaching is added, the first 2 areas, participants' understanding and their ability to demonstrate skills, remain high. But look at what happens to participants' use with fidelity. That number goes up significantly. If there is an expectation that staff not just understand and demonstrate skills, but use them with fidelity, then the support needs to be in place along with effective instructional practices. So thinking back to the key points around professional learning, it needs to be provided with ongoing support. It needs to be data-driven. It needs to be required, use effective instructional practices, and be provided around clearly defined skills and concepts that are aligned within a broad plan. What is one example of something your team has done to ensure high quality professional learning, including opportunities for ongoing support? If you could just take a moment to reflect and then share that in the chat with Emilie, that would be great.
So a couple of the first few chats have been, we spend some time doing presentation of theory and have people with expertise in this area, or at least, you know, knowledge and skill built already providing the actual training. Having team members come to this conference as an opportunity to connect and grow. Couple people are mentioning using their instructional coaches connected to the learning and prioritized needs within buildings. Frequent surveys to guide professional learning needs for staff. I see a couple people saying heavily focused on the presentation of theory, general staff. So that's great, and that's part of this puzzle, right? But it can't be where everybody stops, and I think that's what some of the folks are saying in the chat, is that we're doing really good at that, and then where does it go from there? Book studies, folks are saying, as a way to build knowledge. Connecting professional development to SLOs and PPGs. Encouraged administrators to learn more about reflective supervision, using feedback within instructional or coaching cycles and observational opportunities. That's great. Thank you all for sharing in the chat. These are fantastic. I know I missed a couple, but thank you. I tried to hit most of them.
Yeah, those are some really, really great suggestions for people too. And you don't have to create something new, right? I heard a lot of people sharing things that they were already doing or already had in place, and they were using that, like using instructional coaches that are already present in the building. And we started this off by saying instruction is a key piece of PBIS. And I think as we talked about those core components of instruction, it's clear they're not different for behavior in how you implement those things. So really connecting to instruction and instructional coaches, using structures that are in place with SLOs and PPGs and supportive administrators. Some people were even getting at the data piece, which is the next section here, when they're talking about surveys to see what staff may need and what's working for them. So thank you for sharing those, and hopefully those are helpful to some other teams that are on here as they're thinking about some potential next moves in these areas. So the last set of pitfalls does occur around the collection and use of data. So the first point, spend little time using data. Some teams struggle to collect and use data for planning. And while they may look at it, they get busy doing a lot of other things, such as planning monthly celebrations or ordering prizes for giveaways, and end up spending very little time using the data. For teams that do use data regularly, pitfalls may include a narrow focus on student outcome data and little focus on other data types, including framework implementation data, for example, the TFI, training and coaching data, and fidelity data, or data on how staff are actually implementing the practices. Other pitfalls may occur when focusing on student outcome data, which is really important, but should never be the only type of data collected and used, and include not disaggregating data for decision making, and or spending time focusing on individual students, and or using the data as a way to reinforce deficit beliefs about students and families, and jumping to strategizing solutions to change or fix them. So take a minute again and reflect and think about, how does your team use data? Has your team fallen into one of these pitfalls? If so, which one? And then if you could continue to share in the chat with Emilie, that would be fantastic.
So I see people have said one data point, an over-reliance on student outcome data, sometimes too much of a focus on individual student data being used. Often use the big five data, but don't dig deeper into disaggregated data or patterns. A couple people have even said very little time is being spent on data. But I see a lot of other people saying student data used a lot. We've lost the focus on our data. Thanks, Mike. We don't collect and analyze effectively. A couple other people have said we have one person that is responsible for the data and presenting it and really understanding it, and then other team members are focused on other things. Sometimes it's even just getting the right data to the right person within the team. I'm not sure everyone understands how to look at the data or how to look at what we have available. Yeah, thank you for sharing this.
Okay, so how to avoid or overcome some of those pitfalls. The first step is identifying some of them, right? And it's really exciting to, I have no idea how many people are sharing because it's going to Emilie, but it seems as she's scrolling, I see her eyes go that many people are sharing a lot of thoughts and recognizing some areas where maybe there could be some growth. So first and most importantly, teams and school staff need to take responsibility for the outcomes for each student and engage in data-based decision-making with a specific focus on equity. Inequitable outcomes are examined from a system perspective. Going to say that again. Inequitable outcomes are examined from a system perspective. The team asks themselves, what conditions have we created that advantage some student groups and disadvantage others? In other words, how is the system ensuring success for some student groups and creating barriers for others? And with that question in mind, the team collects and uses multiple types of data to inform next steps for professional learning and ongoing support for staff and adjustments needed in the system. This data includes framework implementation data, so assessments such as the TFI that measure the extent to which those core pieces of PBIS are in place, data on the impact of professional learning and ongoing support for staff. So data that looks at whether or not the outcomes of the training and support were met. Specifically, was it provide? Do staff understand the concepts trained? And are they able to demonstrate the skills? Fidelity data. So understanding how staff use or implement the practices as intended with all students. Because what we can know for sure is if staff aren't using the practices, students cannot benefit from practices they're not receiving. And disaggregated student outcome data, at a minimum by race and by students with IEPs to understand the impact on student groups. So take a minute and reflect on how your team has overcome pitfalls around the collection and use of data. And then if you could share some examples in the chat with Emilie again, that would be really helpful for all the teams.
Matt has one coming in saying, update new BIFs, B-I-F. I'm not sure what that would mean. Building in a behavior intervention form, maybe. That's just a guess. So Matt, if you have any clarifying information, feel free to put that in the chat. Yes, he says. Okay. EduClimber. A couple people said EduClimber. We've implemented bi-monthly groups to focus on areas noted in our data, like our specific data, behavior data. EduClimber makes our data much more easy to understand. Okay. So that there's going to be national pyramid model data that will come out within a system to think about it by child, classroom, program data, to sort kind of behavior data, fidelity data, specific student outcomes. See EduClimber. Somebody says that they have an equity check at every meeting. What does this mean for each of our student populations? Let's see, keeping the data present. Ashley says, keeping the data present for all staff with intentional goal setting. Staff share out their goals in order to problem solve, share effective strategies, and celebrate successes as a whole group. Thank you all for continuing to put stuff in the chat. This is very helpful to just check in and see what you're thinking.
Yeah, and there are some really great offers in there around one that wasn't even mentioned in here is having somewhere, I'm assuming with something like EduClimber, Emily had said EduClimber, somewhere to keep your data that people have access to and you're able to use. There were a couple things that I think addressed some of those pitfalls that people had talked about earlier with one person is responsible for the data, or we have it, we may not even really know how to use it, or only a couple people can use it. And some of the solutions that people have come up with here around maybe groups that use data, or helping staff understand the data, right? So showing staff data and using data with staff to build everyone's capacity to use data. So it doesn't just always live with one person, it becomes part of what you all do. And also part of what you all do, right? That equity check at all meetings, really thinking about the impact of what you're doing on all student groups. So thank you for sharing those. So think about that, and then share in the chat again that key learning and how you will share that, just one thing, with your team. And then as they start to come in, Emilie will be sharing out those ideas and themes that she sees.
Well, already a couple of people have said needing to lean in and use a wider variety of data sources, avoiding the one and done learning with staff. Yep, data, team meetings are used, spending looking at multiple sources of data, being intentional about ongoing support. Important to connect with other initiatives. Yes, right? Especially this year, like there is so much happening in every single school year. Look at me just getting excited about it. Thank you for taking that away. Because if there's one thing we could do, it's maybe connecting it to and prioritizing what we're doing. I saw a couple people say that their team meetings are spent too much on celebrations. So they've got to really adjust that to be the work of a team, not just the work of the celebration committee. The idea of clarifying core components of our PBIS work. So how do we do that with our team? And somebody said that they were going to share that at their next team meeting. And I see there's some disconnect between teams of SEL and PBIS and needing to connect those. Yes. How do similar teams within your building do the work? Share with my team that identifying pitfalls will make our implementation team stronger. So then maybe identifying pitfalls as a team activity. Thank you for sharing that. Because a couple people have said, yep, this is what I want to share with my team, but not necessarily how. So that's really good to know. That would be a really interesting activity to do. I know when I've talked with teams about that and they've looked over it, it's an interesting conversation to kind of piece out and prioritize. Making sure that families and students are equal shareholders in the process in conjunction with the coaches, staff, administrators, team. Thank you. Yes, that is a point that always hits me when I see that, equal weight. So a couple of last just comments on the importance of expanding use. I think there were several data pieces, and then supporting each other so that we can do this in a timely. There you go.
Fantastic. And I'll thank you all so much for your reflection and your participation and your really great thoughts in this session. We really appreciate it.